I just finished rereading all 5 books in the Hunger Games series, and I thought it would be fun to do a video ranking the books from my favorite to my least favorite. I want to start off this video by saying that I love this series. I loved every single one of these books. That being said, there are subtle differences that I noticed among the books. My lowest ranked book was a bit of a surprise to me because I thought it would be The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, but when I read all 5 books back to back, starting with The Hunger Games, reading that entire trilogy, then reading The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and then reading Sunrise on the Reaping. Sunrise on the Reaping was definitely my least favorite book out of the 5. I still gave this book 4.5 out of 5, so I did enjoy this book a lot. But upon my second reading, everything I talked about in my review video still held true. I didn't really connect with Haymitch's character. I had a really hard time visualizing him as young Haymitch, and it felt even more disjointed because this book was written in first person. The other thing I didn't really connect with in this book was the romance. The relationship between Haymitch and Lenore Dove didn't really resonate with me. We were given very little about their relationship aside from the fact that they love each other like all fire. That being said, I did really love Lenore Dove's character. I thought she was a beautifully written character, and I was very sad at the end when she was fed one of the poisoned gumdrops and died. I was very emotional with that scene, but it was less so because of their relationship than the fact that I really loved that character. The other thing I really wish we had in this book was new information or a new perspective. This followed very similarly to the first 2 books in the Hunger Games series, so The Hunger Games and Catching Fire, in terms of the book starting with the reaping, going into the Hunger Games, and then showing kind of like the aftermath. So it followed a very similar formula to the first 2 books in the trilogy, and I would have liked something a little bit different. So for that reason, this was my least favorite book out of the 5, but I thought it was very well written and I enjoyed it overall, and I would still stand by my rating of 4.5 for this book. I've only ranked 1 book and there are 4 to go, but I loved all 4 of these books so much. I give them all 5 out of 5, so we're really splitting hairs at this point in terms of the ranking. But based on what I've said so far in this video, I don't think you'll be surprised that the book that I ranked 4th out of the 5 books is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. What I am a little bit surprised by is how much I enjoyed this book on my second read. I loved this book. I first read this book a year ago. I was in Cuba and I took this book as my beach read, but this I wouldn't say is a beach read. It's a very dark and disturbing book. And maybe that, along with a discussion that I had in book club, kind of affected my perception of this book. But now, a year later, reading it in the comfort of my own home, without really talking about it with other people, just reflecting on my own thoughts and feelings, this book is up there. I considered ranking this book first, but then I thought about all of the moments that I loved in the original trilogy and I decided to put this book 4th. I will say though that this book was, I think, the best written book out of all 5 books. This book is the only one that was in 3rd person, and I thought that was a really good choice by the author because of the nature of Snow's character. He is not a likable character. He's definitely got some narcissistic qualities, some psychopathy. Even though he's not a likable character, I did find him quite nuanced, and there were times where he displayed some sort of conscience. He seems to really care for his cousin Tigress and also his grandmother. He seems to really care for Lucy Gray, but there are a lot of mixed up things, some really twisted things in his mind where you don't know if he truly cares for these people or if there's some sort of hidden agenda that all comes back to him. I found myself rooting for him to be a good person, even though, you know, he turns out to be President Snow, who is an extremely terrible person, very twisted, very unhinged. But I thought the character was so well written, even though I didn't like him as a person. That was actually the point that came up in book club. All of the people who read this book thought Snow's character was very one-dimensional, but as I mentioned, I found this character to be extremely well written and very multi-dimensional. Even though we know where he ends up, you can see his inner conflict apparent in a lot of parts of the book, and I noticed this particularly on my second read because we had had that book club discussion. But of course you can see that he is very manipulative and very paranoid, and this comes up repeatedly in this book when he is going through these periods of inner conflict. You can tell that his mind is playing tricks on him. His mind automatically twists things into him being the victim, to people being against him. I feel like that is very representative, albeit on a much more extreme scale, of what all of our minds are capable of. I know I have twisted situations in my mind, and it takes me a little bit of time to get some perspective. The problem is Snow's character is so deeply flawed that he loses his grip on reality. He just doesn't have the same level of compassion and empathy. This is a very brutal and devastating book, especially when you see that Coriolanus Snow had a lot of people in his life that cared about him. He had a good friend, he had Lucy Gray, he had his cousin, he had his grandmother, he had his teacher, all of these people who care about him and want to support him, and still he was able to twist all of that. I just found this book to be an incredibly interesting and masterful study of a character who ended up being what is essentially a narcissistic psychopath. The relationship between Coriolanus and Lucy Gray I thought was well developed, especially when compared to Haymitch and Lenore Dove, but I still didn't connect with it on the same level as Katniss and Peeta. Upon my second reading of this book, I loved Lucy Gray's character even more than I did the first time. She really stood out to me as someone who was herself. She's a unique individual. She has a hard time trusting people, and unfortunately she placed her trust in someone who did not deserve it, who ended up betraying her. I thought the ending was incredible. It was so well written. You don't know what happens to Lucy Gray. Did Coriolanus Snow end up shooting her when he was firing the weapon in the woods? I love that there's a mystery at the end. We don't know what happened to her, which is foreshadowed by her name poem. There was just a lot about this book that I loved. Reading these books back to back means that I read Mockingjay right before this one, and in Mockingjay we meet Tigress, who is President Snow's cousin. Now, when I first read Mockingjay, this wasn't apparent. This isn't something that is in the book, so we don't know that Tigress is President Snow's cousin. I actually forgot that character's name. I only remember that she looked like a cat. So upon my second read, because I had just finished Mockingjay, when I read this book, that is when I clued in that President Snow's cousin was the same Tigress from Mockingjay. That is a pretty big point that I had overlooked completely the first time, because the first time I read this book, I hadn't read the Hunger Games series in probably over 10 years, and I can't remember when I last watched the movies either. But cluing into that made this book so much more enjoyable because I noticed all these little details about Tigress. In Mockingjay, Tigress basically only consumes raw meat, and in this book, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, we find out that that's always been her preference. So I thought that was really interesting. The only thing that I didn't really love about this book was the pacing. I thought the pacing was fine for the majority of the book. Even though this book is quite long, I think it's around 50% longer than each of the books in the original Hunger Games trilogy. I found the pacing was pretty steady, not too slow and certainly not too fast, but when we got to the death of Sejanus Plinth, I thought that entire section was so rushed. I didn't feel like his death got the time that it deserved because I really loved that character, how he provided a counterbalance to President Snow and how he always wanted to do the right thing. He was the moral counterbalance to Snow's psychopathy, but the way his death was written, it left me feeling quite quite detached. I think if that part had been a little bit more fleshed out in terms of the way it was written, it would have had much more emotional resonance. But that is a very minor point. Overall, I would give it 5 stars. I loved this book. Now we are into the 3 books in the Hunger Games trilogy, and I'm not sure if this one's going to be a surprise, but the book I ranked 3rd is the original Hunger Games, book 1 in the trilogy. The reason I put this book 3rd is because I felt like it was the least well written out of all of the 5 books. And I don't mean that as an insult. I just think the author's writing got better and better and better. And by the time I came back to this book almost 20 years after it was written, I noticed that the writing was different. I noticed that the sentences were structured in a very basic way, very short sentences, almost a choppy style of writing. I still enjoyed the book, but I had to put it a little bit lower in relation to the other 2 books in the trilogy. I usually don't notice the writing in books unless it's something that specifically stands out to me, and the writing in this book stood out to me, especially having just read Sunrise on the Reaping, which I thought was very well written. That being said, this story still drew me in and kept me there. I love this book so much. It is the book that started it all. We meet Katniss and Prim and Gale and Effie and Peeta and Haymitch. These are names that we are all so familiar with now that we are 5 books into this series. And if you are a huge fan of the Hunger Games series like I am, just saying those names might bring a smile to your face. I thought the pacing was fantastic. I loved learning about this dystopian world. And this book made me feel all the feels, especially with Rue. I loved Rue's character so much. She was probably my favorite character in this book. And as well, the whole story around Katniss and Peeta and the bread and him noticing her from such a young age and essentially being so enamored by her, that really made me feel all the feels. And I am not one for romance in books, but I feel like this was done so well. The other thing that really came out for me with this reread was the entire character of Peeta. For the majority of this book, I don't think we're meant to know whether he genuinely has feelings for Katniss or whether it is all part of his strategy for the Hunger Games. And it reminded me that I had these feelings and these questions about Peeta the first time I read this book. It was like, is he being genuine? I really felt that uncertainty, paralleling how Katniss felt in this book. She wasn't sure either whether it was all just an act. And I think that's a reflection of how well written this book was in terms of the author wanting to convey Katniss's confusion and her doubts about Peeta, so much so that I, as the reader, felt it myself. Even though I know from having read the entire series that Peeta is genuine, that he truly does have feelings for Katniss. So I love this book, can't say enough about it, but it is 3rd on my list, which is just, I can't even. I had a hard time ranking Catching Fire and Mockingjay. When I was reading Catching Fire, I was like, okay, this is the best book. I love this book. This is going to be number 1 for me. And actually, when I was reading Mockingjay, I felt very similarly because Mockingjay is quite dark, and I feel like Catching Fire is a little bit more hopeful. There's a part of me that wants to put hope first, but I did end up placing it 2nd. The only reason being that I just feel like this book was a little more straightforward, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about Mockingjay. This book is very similar to the first book in terms of there being a reaping, although the reaping is just a farce in District 12 because we were picking from the existing pool of victors and there weren't that many victors in District 12. So after the reaping were the Hunger Games and then the aftermath. So very similar in terms of the structure of the first book, but when I think of the Hunger Games, besides Rue from the first book, I often think of the events of Catching Fire. So I feel like the clock arena was just so interesting, and it's something that made so much sense to me. I have seen the movie, so I have those visual elements in my head, but even without watching the movie, I think I could very easily visualize this arena. The author really brought the arena to life in terms of how it was described in the book. I loved meeting all of the characters, which we will meet again in Sunrise on the Reaping. So Beatty, Wiress, Mags. I love that there was this alliance. Even though this book still is quite dark, for me it was the most hopeful book out of all 5 books, and I just loved all of the characters in this book. I loved Finnick and Joanna and Cinna. Every single character just like jumped off the page at me. I mentioned earlier in this video that the writing of the first book stood out to me as being a little bit choppy. I didn't notice that about this book, even though this book was written around a year after the first book. I thought the romance between Katniss and Peeta was done so well in this entire series, but in this book I especially felt their care for one another. Even though they weren't really together romantically in this book, you could tell that they cared for each other so much, that they felt some sort of love and responsibility towards each other, and it was just very nicely written. I love how their romance went through a lot of ups and downs, and I think that's what makes it believable for me, that it didn't happen too quickly. It happened over the course of 3 books. It slowly unfolded in a way that really had me rooting for them by Mockingjay. We have come to my favorite book in the Hunger Games universe, and that is Mockingjay, ranked number 1. The cover is absolutely gorgeous as well, and I recently noticed that under the dust jacket there's this beautiful embossing. I haven't checked all the books for it, but I did check Sunrise on the Reaping, which has this gorgeous embossing as well. Since I'm here, why not check the rest? Oh yeah. And last one. Oh, what a pleasant surprise. I've had the original trilogy for so long, and I've never taken off the dust jacket. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes I have in the paperback version, so I can't check that one. Back to Mockingjay. This book was so brutal, so devastating. The reason that I thought about ranking this below Catching Fire and making Catching Fire my number 1 was the aspect of hope that was in Catching Fire, and also because this book made me sad. I fell into a funk with this book. Maybe it was the timing of when I read it, maybe it was the content, but for a lot of this book I thought, you know what, this is definitely below Catching Fire for me. It was really only towards halfway through the book, or maybe the back third of the book, where I was like, this book is amazing. Even though it is a very dark, grim book, it was so well written. It had me feeling very emotional, and it was complex. I feel like this book was very well paced, but the plot had some interesting twists and had me wondering about a lot of people. I wasn't sure what would happen to Peeta after that horrendous reunion where he's essentially programmed to kill Katniss on sight. That was absolutely devastating, especially because we're in Katniss's mind. This is written in first person, and we're envisioning this beautiful reunion like Finnick and Annie just had. There were just so many parts of this book that had me feeling raw. I was so sad when Boggs died, when Finnick died, and Finnick had become one of my favorite characters with this reread. When Prim died, it was just, oh my gosh, it was just like blow after blow after blow after blow. This book was, oh, it was really, really, really dark. But I loved the romance. I loved the romance between Finnick and Annie. Even though we didn't know that much about it, it was very believable to me. I love how Peeta went through ups and downs in his recovery. It wasn't just a progression towards healing. There were a lot of setbacks. There were a lot of moments where he didn't want to be alive anymore. There was just a lot of emotion in this book. It was written brilliantly. It made me feel so many things. The reason I ended up putting this book first were all of the emotions that I felt. That to me is the hallmark of a great book, when I feel all the feels. And also, I really loved the twists and turns in the plot, where you don't really know what's going to happen. The twist at the end with Katniss killing President Coin with the arrow that was marked for President Snow. I thought that was just a fantastic way of revealing another twist in the plot. There were a lot of red flags with President Coin and the way she was running District 13, but you never knew for sure. And at the point that Katniss released the arrow, you're still trying to make sense of all of these things that had just happened. I loved this book because it was different from the first two books, whereas the first two books, along with Sunrise on the Reaping, followed the same formula in terms of the reaping, the arena, the aftermath. This book had a different twist. It was like a real world Hunger Games. To me, this was the best book in the series, even though I gave 4 books out of the 5 a 5 out of 5. I just love this book so much. That is going to be it for my ranking of the 5 books in the Hunger Games series. Please let me know down below if you've read all 5 books and how you would rank them. Have you read the books back to back, and did that change your opinion? Thank you all so much for watching this video. I will be back very soon with another one. Until then, please take care and bye for now.